The morning sun pierced through the thin veil of fog that hung over the sprawling, dusty field. The camp was a makeshift prison, a place where time seemed to stand still under the constant strain of war. Barbed wire fences stretched out in all directions, and sentry towers loomed like silent, ever-watchful giants. The air smelled of the earth, damp from the morning dew, and the distant murmur of a nearby river provided a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. John Carter stood at the edge of the camp, his boots sinking slightly into the mud as he looked across the grounds. The camp wasn't much, just rows of weathered barracks and the occasional rusted truck, but it had become a home of sorts for the prisoners who had been brought here. John's fingers rested lightly on the worn wooden neck of his guitar, a tool he had used for comfort ever since his own war experiences had started to weigh heavy on his soul. "John," a voice called out from behind him. Turning, John saw Sergeant Miller approaching, his face as serious as always. "You're not supposed to be here alone. The prisoners are arriving today." John nodded, but there was a spark of curiosity in his eyes. The arrival of the German prisoners was the talk of the camp. The U.S. had begun capturing more of the enemy forces, and with them came the responsibility of housing them, though not with the hospitality one might expect. "I know, Sergeant," John said, his voice low, "but I figured I could at least try to make this place feel a little less like a prison." He strummed the guitar lightly, producing a few simple chords. Something familiar. Sergeant Miller watched him for a moment, the hard lines of his face softening slightly. "Well, just make sure you don't start anything," he said, a rare hint of humor in his voice. "We don't need any trouble." As the convoy of trucks rolled up, John couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. These men were enemies, men who had been fighting against his country, against his people, but now they were prisoners. And in that moment, John felt a strange sense of responsibility, not just as a soldier, but as someone who had seen the depths of human suffering and wanted to bring a little light into the dark corners of this war-torn world. The trucks came to a halt, and the men disembarked, their movements stiff, eyes scanning their new surroundings. They were tired, worn down, and still adjusting to their new reality. John observed them closely, wondering what they were thinking. He wasn't sure yet what role music would play here, but he had a feeling that it would soon become something more than just a distraction. The camp stood silent under the early morning light, its towering fences like jagged teeth against the sky. It was a desolate place, as if the war had bled all the life from it. The ground was hard and cracked, the air filled with the scent of dust and metal. The faint hum of distant chatter could be heard, mingling with the occasional clink of chains as the prisoners of war shuffled about their morning routines. John Carter stood near the wire fence, his gaze distant, looking out over the camp that had become his temporary home. His uniform was worn, sleeves rolled up to reveal sun-kissed forearms. The guitar slung over his shoulder was the only comfort he'd found since arriving here. The strings were old, the wood faded, but it was still his escape, a way to block out the noise of war, if only for a little while. "You sure you're allowed to be out here by yourself, Carter?" The voice of Sergeant Miller interrupted John's thoughts. John turned to see the older man approaching, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel as he walked. Miller's face was hardened from years of service, a constant scowl etched into his features. "I'm just taking a breather, sir," John replied, offering a small smile. "Thought I'd get a few chords in before the new batch of prisoners arrive." Miller raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything further. He knew the tension had been building for weeks. The arrival of more German POWs was a heavy weight hanging over everyone's heads. No one knew exactly what to expect from the newcomers, but there was an undercurrent of unease. These men were the enemy. And yet, John couldn't help but feel a flicker of empathy. They were soldiers just like him, caught in a war neither had chosen. "I'd keep it down, though," Miller added, his voice more serious now. "We don't want to make things worse than they already are." John nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. The camp was a powder keg waiting to ignite, and music, especially country music with its raw emotional power, might just be the spark. Still, the guitar remained a part of him, a silent rebellion against the chaos of war. As the trucks rumbled in, John glanced over. watching as the first of the German prisoners disembarked. Their faces were blank, resigned, though John could see the subtle tension in their posture. They were far from home, their fate uncertain. The music he played, even the simplest tunes, might be the only thing that could bridge the vast gulf between them. The trucks rolled in slowly, kicking up a cloud of dust as they came to a stop. The engines rumbled for a moment before falling silent, the only sound now the shuffle of boots on the dry ground. John stood to the side, watching with a mixture of curiosity and caution as the prisoners of war began to disembark. There were at least 30 men, their faces grim, their eyes hollow from weeks of confinement and transport. They were thin, their uniforms stained and torn, but their posture remained straight, a sign of pride perhaps, or the remnants of discipline they'd carried with them from their time in the German army. The guards flanked them, rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces unreadable as they herded the men into a loose formation. John could feel the tension hanging thick in the air. These men were the enemy, after all. They had fought against his country, against his people. But as he watched them, something else stirred inside him, a sense of understanding, of recognition. One of the prisoners, a tall man with dark brown hair and a weathered face, glanced up and met John's gaze. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe fear, maybe just exhaustion, but it was a look John knew well. He had seen it in the eyes of his comrades when they'd first arrived at their deployment stations. The look of men who had been thrown into something far beyond their control. John didn't know what he expected when they arrived, but this wasn't what he had imagined. He had been prepared for hostility, for resentment, for anger, but instead he saw only weariness, the kind that could only be born of the brutal grind of war. The tall man, who appeared to be the oldest of the group, took a step forward, his eyes scanning the area. He seemed to take in the dusty camp, the barbed wire, the soldiers standing guard. There was a brief moment of silence before he spoke, his voice thick with a German accent. "What is this place?" he asked, his words heavy with a mix of confusion and defiance. John was caught off guard by the question. It wasn't a challenge, more of a simple inquiry. The man wasn't demanding answers, but he wanted to know where he had ended up. "Just a holding camp for now," John replied, his voice steady despite the unfamiliarity of the situation. "For the duration of the war. Just a place to keep you until things get sorted." The man nodded, but his eyes never left John's. There was something almost searching in them, as if trying to gauge whether John was a friend or a foe. John couldn't be sure what the man was thinking, but there was a flicker of something in his gaze, something that suggested he had more on his mind than just survival. As the prisoners were ushered into their designated barracks, John stayed where he was, lost in thought. He had always been just a soldier, never thinking much beyond the battlefield. But now, standing here among these men, the lines between enemy and ally seemed a little more blurred, and for the first time since the war began, John wondered if music might be the thing to bridge that gap. The day was sweltering, the sun beating down mercilessly on the camp, as John sat in the corner of the mess hall, guitar resting in his lap. The prisoners had been assigned to their quarters, and the soldiers were going about their duties, eyes occasionally flicking toward the newcomers. John had been quiet, observing them, trying to understand what he was witnessing, what he was a part of. He strummed a few chords softly, the music barely audible over the hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes. He wasn't trying to attract attention, just playing for himself, a distraction from the weight of everything. He had heard rumors about the German prisoners, heard the fear and anger in the voices of his fellow soldiers, but none of that seemed to matter right now. As he played, John felt a growing connection to the guitar. The notes seemed to carry him away from the harsh reality of the camp, each chord a reminder that there was still something beautiful in the world, something that wasn't defined by the war, by the lines drawn between countries, between men. The door to the mess hall creaked open, and John's fingers froze. He didn't look up, but he heard the sound of boots hitting the floor, the shuffle of feet. He could feel their eyes on him, and though he wasn't certain, he suspected the newcomers had heard the music too. It was impossible to ignore, especially with the way it seemed to fill the space between people, making them pause and listen, even if they didn't understand it. The tall German prisoner from earlier stood just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. He was clearly hesitant, unsure of where he belonged in this new foreign environment, and yet there was something almost magnetic in his gaze, something that seemed to pull John's attention toward him. The man was listening to the music, though he likely didn't recognize the tune. John strummed another chord louder this time, testing the waters. The notes hung in the air, their simplicity cutting through the tension of the room. For a brief moment everything else seemed to stop. The mess hall fell silent, and John could feel all eyes on him, as though they were waiting for something. The German prisoner moved closer, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smiling, but there was something almost questioning in the way he looked at John, as if he were trying to figure out what the music meant. John stopped playing, the tension in the room palpable. The silence stretched on for a moment longer before the man spoke, his voice thick with an accent. "What is this music?" he asked, his eyes still locked on the guitar. John hesitated, but then he smiled softly, a glimmer of understanding passing between them. "Country music," he said simply. "It's something we play to remind us of home." The next few days in the camp felt heavier, the air thick with the weight of unspoken tension. The German prisoners kept to themselves mostly, their movements stiff and guarded, while the soldiers, John included, kept their distance. Despite the initial curiosity sparked by the guitar, John's attempts at playing country music seemed to have little effect on easing the unease. In fact, it only seemed to increase the tension. John was used to music as a form of connection, a universal language, but here among these men it felt foreign. It wasn't just the German prisoners who were uncomfortable, it was the soldiers too. They had been trained to view the enemy as a threat, not as fellow human beings who could find solace in a song. The tall German man from the mess hall, whom John had learned was named Heinrich, watched from a distance, his gaze lingering on the guitar. John noticed this every time he played, but the distance between them never seemed to close. Heinrich's eyes were filled with something John couldn't quite place, uncertainty maybe, but every time they met, there was an odd flicker of something else. Curiosity. One evening, John sat under the dim light of a lantern, his guitar resting in his hands. He strummed lightly, the soft sound carrying over the otherwise quiet camp. Suddenly, a sharp voice broke through the air. "What is that supposed to be?" The voice was thick with anger. John looked up to see one of the other German prisoners, a stocky man with a jagged scar running across his face, standing a few feet away. His eyes were narrowed, and his hands were clenched into fists. "I don't know why you Americans insist on this nonsense," the man continued, his voice growing louder. "Music? You think this will make us forget what we've lost?" John felt a knot form in his stomach. He had known there would be resistance, but he hadn't expected this kind of hostility. The music was meant to bring comfort, not stir up conflict. "I'm just playing to pass the time," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. "No harm in it." The man sneered, taking a step closer. "You Americans are all the same. You think you can fix everything with a song with your trivialities." John's fingers tightened around the neck of the guitar, the tension rising in the air. He could feel the eyes of the other prisoners on him, some watching with curiosity, others with judgment. It was clear that not everyone shared his vision of music as a bridge between cultures. Heinrich, standing off to the side, looked torn. John's gaze met his, and for a fleeting moment he saw something in Heinrich's expression, a flicker of understanding, but also doubt. "You should stop playing," the scarred man spat, "before someone makes you." John's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. "I'll play if I want to." The words hung in the air, heavy with defiance, but also uncertainty. Would the music lead to more conflict, or could it somehow be the key to breaking down the walls between them all? Days passed, but the unease in the camp only seemed to grow. Despite John's attempts to connect through music, the divide between the American soldiers and the German prisoners remained palpable. The prisoners, particularly the older ones, clung to their pride and their customs. Their world was one of duty and discipline, and the carefree strumming of a guitar seemed almost like a mockery of everything they had fought for, everything they had lost. John continued to play, but the music felt more and more like a solitary act. The sound of his guitar, once a source of comfort, now seemed to echo off the walls of the camp, reverberating in the silence between the two sides. It was as though the music had become a point of contention, a reminder that they were all on opposite sides of a war that had torn their lives apart. Heinrich, who had been watching from a distance more often now, was one of the few who didn't look at John with hostility or confusion. There was something about his eyes, curious, though always guarded, that made John feel as if there was more to him than the hardened soldier he appeared to be. One afternoon, after the usual work assignments, John was sitting on the steps of the barracks, guitar in hand. The camp was quieter than usual, the oppressive heat making everything seem still, like a simmering pot waiting to boil over. John strummed a soft tune, his fingers moving mechanically over the strings, his mind lost in the rhythm. He wasn't thinking of the war, or the division, or the harsh words that had been exchanged earlier. He was just playing. But when he glanced up, he saw Heinrich standing a few paces away, his arms crossed over his chest, watching him intently. John stopped playing, the sudden silence heavy between them. The tension was thick, but there was also something else. A silent understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of one. "You like this music?" John asked, cautiously breaking the silence. Heinrich didn't answer immediately, instead taking a step forward, his boots scraping softly against the dirt. His face was unreadable, but there was a slight furrow in his brow, as if he was still trying to make sense of what was happening. "I don't know," Heinrich said finally, his voice low, heavy, with an accent that made every word sound more deliberate. "It is different. I don't understand it, but it is." He paused, his eyes meeting John's. "It is not bad." John smiled slightly, lowering the guitar in his hands. "It's something that helps us forget the bad for a little while," he said quietly. "Helps us remember the good." The air between them seemed to shift, and for the first time John felt the weight of the war, the walls that divided them, lessen, just for a moment. But even that small moment of connection was fragile, and John knew the challenges ahead would not be easily overcome. As days turned into weeks, the Cold War of silence between the American soldiers and the German POWs began to crack, albeit slowly. John kept to his routine of playing his guitar, though now he did so with more care. He noticed that Heinrich was often close by, though always just far enough to avoid direct contact. John didn't press the issue. He wasn't sure what to make of Heinrich yet, but he could feel something shifting between them. A kind of quiet understanding, perhaps. One afternoon, as the camp settled into the usual rhythm, guards patrolling, prisoners tending to their duties, John was sitting on a crate near the barracks. The sun was beginning to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. The evening air was thick with heat, but there was a breeze that brought a small comfort to the otherwise oppressive atmosphere. John strummed his guitar idly, the familiar notes filling the silence. His fingers moved almost mechanically, but the music felt good, something to hold on to in the midst of all the chaos. Just as he was about to stop, he heard the crunch of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Heinrich standing in front of him, his arms crossed, eyes focused on the guitar. "I've been thinking," Heinrich said, his voice low and measured. "How about the music?" John raised an eyebrow but didn't stop playing. "What about it?" Heinrich shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I still don't understand it. It's different. But I think it's not just a distraction, is it?" John stopped playing, the air around them now charged with an unspoken tension. Heinrich's eyes were on the guitar, but his expression had softened as if trying to grasp something deeper. "It's not just about the music," John replied carefully. "It's a way to hold on to what we have left. A way to remember that there's still something worth fighting for, something good." Heinrich nodded slowly, his face reflecting the struggle within him. He had spent weeks trying to block out the world around him, focusing only on survival, on the war that had torn his country apart. But now, standing in front of John, he couldn't help but feel a small crack in the walls he had so carefully built around himself. For a moment they stood there, neither speaking, both feeling the weight of their shared humanity. Finally, Heinrich broke the silence. "Can you teach me?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. John's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this, but in that moment he realized that the music, something so simple to him, could be the bridge that connected them. "I can try," John said, a smile tugging at his lips. "But it's not easy." Heinrich smiled back, just the faintest hint of a grin, but it was enough. It was a beginning. The weeks that followed saw John and Heinrich meeting more often, though their interactions remained somewhat tentative. They started with small exchanges, basic chords and awkward attempts at playing together. John was patient, understanding that it wasn't just the music that Heinrich was learning. It was trust, something that had to be built slowly, one note at a time. John taught Heinrich simple country songs, explaining their meaning with the same care he would use to explain the lyrics of a war song. "It's not just about strumming the guitar," John told him one afternoon, as Heinrich struggled with a particularly tricky chord. "It's about feeling the words. You can play 1,000 songs, but if you don't feel them, then they're just noise." Heinrich looked at John, his brow furrowed in concentration. "And you feel them?" he asked quietly. John paused for a moment, his fingers resting on the strings of his guitar. It was a question he hadn't really considered before, but as he thought about it, he realized that it was true. The music wasn't just a way to pass the time, it was a way for him to survive, to hold on to something in a world that had become increasingly brutal and uncertain. "Yeah," John said finally, his voice soft. "I feel them." As the days passed, something began to shift. The guitar sessions became less about instruction and more about shared moments of understanding. The camp, with all its harsh realities and tensions, started to feel a little less isolating. John and Heinrich were finding a rhythm together, a silent language that existed beyond words. There were still moments of tension, heated glances from other prisoners or soldiers, who didn't understand why John continued to play, why he risked drawing attention to himself with his guitar. But those moments were fleeting, like brief gusts of wind that threatened to blow everything over, only to be replaced by calm once again. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about something deeper, something they couldn't fully explain. As they played together, there was an unspoken understanding that went beyond nationality, beyond the uniforms they wore, beyond the roles they had been forced to play in a war neither of them had chosen. And in those quiet moments, when the music filled the air, John realized that maybe this was the way forward. The bridge they had built was made of more than just the chords they played. It was made of the trust they had started to build in each other, one song at a time. As the weeks wore on, the tension within the camp only seemed to build. What had begun as a quiet, uneasy peace between the American soldiers and the German prisoners had slowly deteriorated into something more volatile. Whispers spread among the prisoners about John's continued playing, his refusal to stop when asked, and how his guitar became more than just an instrument. It became a symbol of defiance. The music, which had once been a small bridge between two men, was now seen by others as a dangerous distraction. It was no longer just a personal escape for John. It was a mark of rebellion. He could feel the shift every time he strummed a note. The eyes of the soldiers seemed to linger longer on him. Some watched with suspicion, others with disdain. And, among the prisoners, it was no better. There was a growing divide between those who had come to understand the music's purpose, those like Heinrich, and the others who saw it as nothing more than a trivial pursuit, an affront to the gravity of their situation. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling work detail, John sat down on the steps outside the barracks, guitar in hand. The heat of the day still clung to the air, but there was a restless energy in the camp. The sound of boots marching echoed through the dirt paths, and the clink of metal from the work crews filled the air. John strummed a quiet melody, his fingers moving almost without thought. The soft notes cut through the atmosphere, and for a moment it was just him and the music. But soon the familiar sound of footsteps interrupted his solitude. This time it wasn't Heinrich. It was one of the other prisoners, a tall man with sharp features and a scowl that seemed permanently etched onto his face. "You're still doing this?" the man sneered, crossing his arms as he stood a few feet away from John. His voice was laced with contempt, and the hostility was clear in his posture. You think this is going to change anything? Music won't stop the war. It won't change what's happening to us." John's fingers paused on the strings, and for a moment the weight of the man's words hung heavily in the air. The camp, the war, the music, it all seemed to clash in that moment. He knew the man was right. The music wasn't going to end the war or fix the mess they were all in. But it wasn't about that, was it? "It's not about changing the war," John said quietly, looking up at the man. "It's about keeping something inside us alive." The tall man's lips curled in a bitter smile. "Alive?" "We're already dead, soldier." The words cut deeper than John expected, but before he could respond, the man turned and walked away, his heavy boots thudding against the dirt. John sat there, guitar resting in his lap, his thoughts swirling. The conflict was growing. The walls between the men were getting higher, and John was starting to feel the weight of what had seemed so simple, music, beginning to tear them all apart. The tension in the camp reached a breaking point as the days stretched on. The sound of boots, the clang of metal, the whispers of unrest, all of it seemed to weigh heavily on John's shoulders. It was no longer just about the guitar or the music, it was about survival. Every note he played, every chord he strummed, felt like an act of defiance. He had become a symbol, not just for the soldiers, but for the prisoners as well. And that was something John hadn't anticipated. One evening, as the camp settled into a quieter rhythm, there was an unexpected announcement. The soldiers had decided to hold a performance. It was to be a show of morale, a small diversion for the troops and prisoners alike, a chance to distract from the constant tension, to briefly forget the horrors of war. It wasn't uncommon in military camps, but John wasn't prepared for what this particular performance would mean. The setup was simple: a makeshift stage, a few chairs scattered around, and the faint glow of a few camp lanterns flickering in the dark. But as the soldiers gathered, John couldn't shake the feeling that this would be more than just a performance. This was a test. A test of loyalty, of what was acceptable, of what could be tolerated. He didn't know how many people, soldiers and prisoners alike, would show up, but he knew this was his chance to prove something. Heinrich had been quiet lately, but as the performance began, John spotted him in the crowd. He was standing by the side, arms crossed, watching as usual, but there was something different in his stance. His eyes weren't just observing now, there was something else there: expectation. John took a deep breath and stepped up to the front of the makeshift stage. The murmur of voices around him quieted slightly, the crowd falling into a stillness that felt unnatural. This was it. He wasn't just playing for himself anymore. This performance would say something, not just through the music, but through the very act of playing. He picked up his guitar, fingers brushing the strings. The first few notes were tentative, almost hesitant. But as he settled into the rhythm, the tension began to ease. The sound of the guitar filled the camp, softer than it had ever been before. The song he chose was simple, a classic country tune, the kind that spoke of home, of loss, and of resilience. For a moment, as the music washed over the crowd, John forgot about the walls between them. He forgot about the war, the divide, the soldiers, the prisoners. All that mattered for a brief moment was the music. As the final notes echoed into the still night air, John lowered the guitar. The camp was silent for a heartbeat before the first clap rang out, followed by another, and then more until the sound of applause filled the night. The performance wasn't perfect. It wasn't even meant to be. But it was real. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the lines between them, soldiers and prisoners, seemed to blur, if only for a moment. The days that followed the performance were charged with a new energy. The camp, though still a place of tension, felt different. There was an unspoken shift, a momentary pause in the ongoing conflict that had ruled their lives for so long. The music had done something that none of the soldiers or prisoners expected. It had opened a small door, allowing a sliver of connection to slip through. But that moment of peace was fragile. John knew it wouldn't be easy. He had seen how quickly things could go from calm to chaos. The tension was still there, lingering in the air, a reminder that even the smallest spark could set everything ablaze. But for the first time in a long time, John felt something other than fear or resignation. He felt hope. It wasn't just about the music anymore. The guitar had become a bridge, yes, but it was more than that. It was a way to say, we are here, we are human. It was a way to fight against the dehumanizing forces of the war, to remind themselves and the others that there was still something worth preserving. But not everyone saw it that way. As John sat outside one evening, strumming his guitar in the fading light, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see one of the American soldiers, a tall, burly man with a grim expression, standing nearby. His arms were crossed and his stance was rigid, as if he had something to say but wasn't sure how to say it. "You still playing that damn thing?" the soldier asked, his tone low but sharp. John didn't stop playing, though his fingers faltered for a moment. He didn't look up, keeping his gaze fixed on the strings. "Yeah, I am." "You're making things harder than they need to be," the soldier continued. "You think they'll forget who we are just because you're playing a couple of songs?" John's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time someone had challenged him, but something about the soldier's words struck deeper this time. The music had always been his escape, his way of holding on to something good, something real. But he had never thought of it as a tool for resistance, not like this. "I'm not trying to make things harder," John said quietly, lowering the guitar. "I'm just trying to make it through, just like everyone else." The soldier scoffed, shaking his head. "You think that'll work? You think they'll start seeing us as people?" John looked up, meeting the soldier's gaze. There was a hardness there, but also something else. Exhaustion, maybe. He understood that. The weight of war was heavy on everyone's shoulders, but they carried it in different ways. "They'll see us as people when we start treating them like people," John said softly. The silence between them stretched on for a moment before the soldier nodded, a begrudging acknowledgement. John knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. But in that moment, he felt as though they had taken one step closer to something better, something worth fighting for. As the days dragged on, the weight of war pressed down on everyone in the camp. It was no longer just the physical exhaustion from long hours of work or the fear of the unknown future. It was the mental toll that seemed to affect everyone, soldier and prisoner alike. John could see it in the way people moved, the dullness in their eyes, the way they avoided contact with one another. He had learned over the months that the human mind had a breaking point, an invisible line where the horrors of war could tear apart a person from the inside. Some soldiers had already crossed that line, and so had some of the prisoners. Heinrich, too, was showing signs of strain. Though he had started to open up to John through their guitar sessions, there were times when he withdrew completely. One evening, after they finished playing, Heinrich sat staring into the distance, his face tight, as if he were seeing something John couldn't. "Hey, you all right?" John asked, his voice gentle but full of concern. Heinrich didn't answer right away. His eyes remained locked on the horizon, but there was a distant, unfocused look to them. "I don't know," Heinrich muttered after a long pause. "It's like everything is just so heavy, the weight of it all, every day, every hour. I'm not sure how much more I can take." John felt a chill run through him. He knew what Heinrich was talking about, the mental exhaustion. The constant reminder that the world they had known was slipping away, replaced by something darker and more unforgiving. John shifted on the ground, sitting next to him. "I know what you mean," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I feel like it's all too much too, but I guess the music helps, even just a little. It's a way to feel something else." "Something good." Heinrich nodded, but his expression remained unchanged. "You think this is the way out? Music? You really think it can save us?" John didn't know how to answer at first. He wasn't sure music could save anyone, but he knew it had been a small respite from the chaos. It gave them moments of clarity when everything else seemed to be crumbling. "It's not about saving us," John said, his words slow but firm. "It's about reminding us that we're still human. We still have something worth holding on to." Heinrich didn't reply, but for the first time in days, John thought he saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. The camp was still a place of suffering and fear. The war still raged on, and the future remained uncertain. But in that fleeting moment, amidst the weight of their shared experience, there was a small spark of something else. Hope. A tiny glimmer, but perhaps that was all they needed to keep going. The tension in the camp had reached a boiling point. The whispers of unrest, once barely noticeable, were now impossible to ignore. John had been playing his guitar less frequently, mostly to avoid drawing attention to himself. But even in those rare moments when he did play, the air was thick with unease. The soldiers had begun to notice the subtle shift among the prisoners. They had heard the murmurs of those who had grown fond of John's music. It didn't take long before the higher-ups started questioning the activities taking place in the camp, especially when a few of the soldiers had begun to see the guitar as a symbol of rebellion. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight dipped beneath the horizon, John was sitting near the barracks, guitar resting against his knee. The familiar notes filled the air, soft and almost melancholic, when a voice broke through the quiet. "Carter." John froze, the strumming of his guitar halting as he looked up to see Sergeant Miller standing a few feet away. The sergeant's face was hard, his eyes narrowed, a shadow of anger or frustration hanging over him. "You need to stop this," Miller said, his voice low but filled with authority. John felt his stomach tighten. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it to feel so heavy. "Stop what?" John asked, his voice steady, though he could feel the tension rising in his chest. "The music." "It's causing problems," Miller said, glancing around as if checking for anyone who might be listening. "Some of the men are starting to think this is more than just a distraction. They're starting to look at this, at you, like you're trying to change something." John's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of the words settled on him like a stone. He had never intended for the music to become anything more than a small escape, but now the soldiers saw it as a threat. The very thing that had been keeping him sane was being used as a reason to silence him. "I'm not trying to change anything," John said, his voice quieter now. "I'm just playing, I'm not hurting anyone." "It's not about hurting anyone, Carter," Miller said sharply. "It's about what it represents. You think the higher-ups will let this slide? You think this camp is a place for music? For peace?" John swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the guitar in his hands. His fingers were trembling slightly. He didn't know what to say. Everything he had been holding on to, the music, the small moments of understanding with Heinrich, the hope, was being taken away from him piece by piece. "This is not a place for that kind of distraction," Miller added, his voice softer now but still firm. "And you need to keep it down, or else it's going to make things worse for everyone." John sat there staring at his guitar, the weight of Miller's words sinking in. He had never felt so alone, and yet the music was the only thing that still felt real to him. The atmosphere in the camp had thickened in the days following Miller's warning. John couldn't help but feel the strain in every moment, the weight of the words he had heard haunting him. Every time he picked up his guitar, the tension gnawed at him, as if the very act of playing was defying something larger, something he couldn't see. He had tried to stay quiet, to let the music fade into the background. But the more he tried to keep it down, the more the silence around him became deafening. It wasn't just the soldiers. The prisoners too had begun to show their discomfort. Some of them, like Heinrich, still saw the music for what it was, a small refuge in an unforgiving world, but others were growing wary. And that wariness began to show in the most unexpected ways. One afternoon, as John sat outside the barracks with his guitar, strumming softly, the sound of boots approaching caught his attention. He looked up to find a group of prisoners standing nearby, staring at him. Among them was the tall man with the scar, the one who had confronted him about his music earlier. This time he wasn't alone. A few others stood with him, their faces hard with disapproval. "You really think your music is going to fix everything?" the scarred man spat, stepping closer to John, his fists clenched. John stopped playing, his fingers lingering on the strings as he looked up at the group. The camp had been quiet for so long that the tension in the air seemed to ripple out like a wave. His heart raced in his chest, but he refused to let it show. "I never said it would fix anything," John replied, his voice steady, though his hands were shaking. "I'm just trying to get through the day, just like everyone else." The scarred man scoffed. "You think they'll forget who we are, huh?" You think playing a guitar is going to make them treat us like people? John stood up slowly, the guitar still in his hands, his posture firm. No. But it's a way to remind us that we are people. For a moment the group stood in silence, their eyes locked on John. The tension was suffocating, but John refused to back down. I'm not trying to change anything. I'm just trying to survive, John said, his voice softer now but resolute. And if the music helps me do that, then I'm not going to stop. The scarred man took a step forward, his face inches from John's. The others watched in silence, waiting for a reaction. John's grip tightened on his guitar, but he didn't flinch. Survival? The man sneered. Survival's not playing your songs, it's fighting. John met his gaze without hesitation. And sometimes survival is remembering who you are. The group stood motionless for a beat, before the scarred man backed away, his lip curled in contempt. He turned and walked off, the others following suit. John's breath came out in a long exhale. His heart still pounded in his chest, but he had made it through this confrontation. But he knew this wouldn't be the last. Days passed after the confrontation with the scarred prisoner, and though the camp returned to its usual rhythm, a lingering unease remained. John's guitar still sat next to him, and he still played occasionally, but now every note seemed heavier. He could feel the weight of the camp pressing in on him, the walls around him growing tighter. It wasn't just the pressure from the soldiers, it was the pressure from the men who had once looked to him for relief. They were starting to doubt. The music wasn't working for them anymore. It wasn't enough to keep the darkness at bay. Heinrich had started withdrawing again, the music no longer a source of solace but a reminder of the walls that separated them. The spark that had once connected them now seemed to flicker weakly. John missed the conversations they'd shared, the small moments of understanding, but he knew that what they were facing was bigger than either of them, bigger than the music. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, John walked to the edge of the barracks and found Heinrich sitting by himself. His gaze was distant, focused on nothing in particular. His hands rested on his knees, his posture rigid. John sat down beside him, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. "You stopped playing," John said quietly, looking at the guitar resting beside Heinrich. Heinrich didn't answer right away. His fingers twitched as if he wanted to reach for the guitar, but stopped himself. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and full of frustration. "What's the point?" he asked. "What good is it doing? Things aren't changing. The war is still here and we're still trapped in this hell." John didn't have an answer for him. He couldn't promise that the music would change anything, couldn't pretend that everything would get better just because they played a song. But he did understand the feeling, the helplessness, the weight of being stuck in a world that seemed to be unraveling at the seams. "I never said the music would fix anything," John said softly. "But it's something. It's a way to remind us that we're still alive, that we're still human, even in all of this." Heinrich looked at him, the pain in his eyes evident. "I don't know if I can keep pretending that's enough," he said quietly. John didn't try to argue. There was no easy solution to their situation. But sitting there beside Heinrich, he realized that maybe they didn't need all the answers right now. Maybe for once they just needed to sit together in the silence and let it be enough. The music, the small moments of understanding, weren't the solution to their suffering, but they were a thread, a fragile thread that connected them to each other and to whatever humanity was left in the world. And sometimes, in the midst of war, that was all they could hold on to. The days grew shorter and the reality of the war never truly left the camp. The promise of an end seemed distant, like a faint light at the edge of a long, dark tunnel. The music that had once been a source of hope, a fleeting escape, now lingered in the background, a quiet presence rather than a solution. Yet it was still there, offering small moments of relief no matter how fleeting. John still played his guitar, but now it was less of a defiant act and more of a quiet routine, one he had come to rely on. There were no grand performances anymore, no crowds of soldiers or prisoners watching in anticipation. The music had become something personal, an inner anchor in the chaos of war. He no longer played to prove a point, but simply to remind himself that amidst the brutality of the world around him, there was still something beautiful worth holding on to. Heinrich, too, had returned to his silence. He still joined John occasionally, though the air between them had shifted. Their conversations had become fewer, more thoughtful, and far less about the world around them. They spoke of the simplest things, of memories, of dreams for the future, but there was no denying the weight they both carried. The war had marked them, and nothing could erase that. One afternoon, as the sky turned a brilliant orange with the setting sun, John and Heinrich sat together on a small patch of grass. The camp was quiet, the only sounds being the distant murmurs of the soldiers and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. John strummed the strings of his guitar softly, a familiar melody that had grown into a personal ritual. Heinrich sat beside him, his eyes closed, his face softened by the music, though he said nothing. "I don't know if I'll ever truly understand why any of this happened," John said, his voice breaking the silence. "But I've learned that sometimes it's not about understanding. It's just about surviving, getting through it." Heinrich opened his eyes and looked at him. For a moment there was no war, no camp, no separation between them. There was just the quiet exchange of a simple truth. "You're right," Heinrich said softly, a small but genuine smile flickering on his face. "It's about surviving, and maybe remembering what it was like to live before all of this." John nodded, his fingers still moving over the guitar strings. The war wasn't over, and their lives were still shaped by its brutality, but in that moment the music gave them a shared space, a place where they could remember who they were before it all. The melody lingered in the air, a reminder of the humanity they still carried inside. And for just a moment, in the quiet of the fading day, the weight of the world felt a little lighter.